August 1941. RAF Duxford, Cambridgeshire, England. The morning mist hung low over the grass airstrip of No. 601 Squadron. This wasn't just any squadron. This was the Millionaire Squadron. These were the aristocrats of the Royal Air Force, men who had been recruited from White's Club in London, men who drove Bentleys, owned racehorses, and had fought in the Battle of Britain with a casual, deadly elegance. They were used to flying the Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire was poetry in motion. It was sleek, responsive, and beautiful. It fit a pilot like a tailored suit. But on this gray morning, the pilots of 601 Squadron were staring at their new aircraft with a mixture of confusion, horror, and distinctly British disdain. Sitting on the tarmac was a machine that looked like an engineering mistake. It was the Bell P-39 Airacobra. It was American. And to the British eye, it was grotesque. "It looks," one flight lieutenant remarked, "like a flying tricycle." And he wasn't wrong. The plane sat on a tricycle landing gear, a nose wheel, which meant it sat flat on the ground, its nose pointed arrogantly at the sky. Every other fighter in the world, the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the German Messerschmitt, was a tail-dragger, sitting nose-high with its tail on the grass. But the strangeness didn't stop at the wheels. "Where is the engine?" another pilot asked. It wasn't in the nose. The nose was strangely slender and tapered. Instead, the massive Allison V12 engine was buried in the middle of the fuselage, directly behind the pilot's seat. It was a mid-engine layout, like a racing car. And then there was the entry. You didn't slide back a canopy and vault in like a fighter pilot. You walked up to the side of the plane, turned a handle, and opened a car door. Literally, an automobile-style door with a roll-down window. "Good God," the squadron leader muttered. "How are we supposed to bail out of that?" But the real horror came when they took it into the air. The RAF pilots took the P-39 up for a combat trial. Their mission was to simulate an intercept of high-altitude German Heinkel bombers. They pushed the throttles forward and climbed. At 10,000 feet, the plane felt heavy. At 15,000 feet, it began to gasp. The engine, starved of oxygen, lost power. At 20,000 feet, it was a brick. It wallowed in the thin air. It couldn't turn. It couldn't climb. A Spitfire could loop around it. A German Messerschmitt could dive on it, attack it, and climb away before the P-39 pilot could even lift his nose. The squadron leader landed, stepped out of his car door, and delivered a scathing report to the Air Ministry. "This aircraft is useless," he wrote. It cannot reach the German bombers. Against a Messerschmitt Bf-109 at altitude, it is a coffin. It is short-ranged, the compass jams when the gun fires, and the cockpit fills with toxic smoke. Send them back. The British rejected the plane. They cancelled their order. They essentially said, "We would rather fly nothing than fly this." The Americans didn't want it either. U.S. Army Air Corps pilots in the Pacific called it the Iron Dog. They joked that it was the only plane in the world that the enemy didn't need to shoot down, because if you flew it long enough, it would eventually kill you on its own. Thousands of these unwanted, unloved machines began piling up in factories in Buffalo, New York, and on docks in Liverpool. They were considered the garbage of the Allied arsenal. A failed experiment. A waste of aluminum. So, the Allies did the only thing they could think of. They boxed them up and shipped them to the Soviet Union. It was a desperate gift to a desperate ally. The Soviet Air Force had been decimated by the Luftwaffe in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. They needed planes, any planes. Even the ones the West considered trash. 3 years later, 1944, the Eastern Front. Above the burning ruins of Jassy, a formation of German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers was pounding a Soviet tank column. High above them, their escort of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s circled, watching for Soviet fighters. They felt safe. They knew the Soviet-built Yaks and Lags were often poorly made and flown by inexperienced pilots. Then, from the clouds below, not from above, but from the mud, a shape erupted. It wasn't a Yak. It wasn't a Spitfire. It was that same American Iron Dog. But here, in the frozen, thick air of the Russian front, it wasn't a dog. It was a monster. The P-39, flown by a Soviet Guards pilot, didn't try to climb high. It stayed low, right on the deck. At low altitude, its Allison engine produced incredible torque. It turned inside the German fighters. It rolled faster than they could follow. And then it fired. Through the propeller hub sat a massive 37mm Oldsmobile T9 cannon. It fired a high-explosive round the size of a soup can. One shot hit the lead Messerschmitt. The German plane didn't just smoke, it disintegrated. The wing sheared off as if cut by a chainsaw. The fuselage burst into a ball of fire. The German pilots panicked. Over the radio, the warning went out, a code word that terrified the Luftwaffe. Achtung! Cobras! Cobras! The plane that the British had thrown in the trash had become the highest-scoring American fighter of the war. Not in American hands, but in the hands of Soviet pilots who turned a reject into a legend. This is the story of the Bell P-39 Airacobra. It is the story of a misunderstood machine. A plane that was built for a war that the West wasn't fighting, but was perfect for the brutal, low-level knife fight of the Eastern Front. It is the story of the Alsib route, the frozen highway where American women and Soviet men ferried these planes across the roof of the world. And it is the story of Alexander Pokryshkin, the rebel ace who defied his commanders to rewrite the rules of air combat, scoring 59 kills in a plane that U.S. pilots were afraid to fly. The West laughed at it. The Germans learned to fear it. This is forgotten thunder. To understand why the P-39 was such a freak of engineering, you have to understand the mind of the man who built it and the strange obsession that birthed it. The Bell Aircraft Corporation in Buffalo, New York, was not a traditional aircraft manufacturer. It was run by Lawrence Larry Bell, a visionary who liked to break rules. In 1937, the U.S. Army Air Corps put out a request for a new interceptor. Most designers, Lockheed, Curtiss, Republic, started the process by looking at an engine. They would pick the biggest, most powerful engine available, and then wrap an aerodynamic skin around it. The guns were an afterthought, bolted into the wings later. Larry Bell started with a gun. The American Ordnance Department had recently developed a weapon that was terrifying in its potential, the 37mm T9 cannon. This wasn't a machine gun. It was a piece of artillery. It was originally designed as an anti-tank gun. It fired a high-explosive shell weighing 1.3 pounds. To put that in perspective, a standard .50 caliber bullet weighs about 1.5 ounces. This cannon didn't punch holes. It blew things apart. It could destroy a bomber with a single hit. It could crack the engine block of a tank. Bell looked at this cannon and said, "I want to make a fighter plane that flies that gun." But there was a massive engineering problem. The gun was huge. It was nearly 8 feet long. It weighed 200 pounds. And the recoil was substantial. If you mounted it in the wings, the recoil would spin the aircraft around like a pinwheel. If you mounted it on the engine cowl, the muzzle blast would blind the pilot. It had to be on the centerline. It had to fire directly through the propeller hub. But in a single-engine fighter, the centerline is occupied by the engine. There was no room for both the massive Oldsmobile cannon and the V12 engine in the nose. So Bell did something radical. He moved the engine. He placed the 1,100 horsepower Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engine in the middle of the fuselage, directly behind the pilot's seat. It was the same configuration used by high-performance racing cars. To get the power to the propeller, he ran a 10-foot-long solid steel drive shaft through the cockpit. It ran between the pilot's legs, under the floor, to a reduction gearbox in the nose. This was insane engineering. Pilots were essentially straddling a spinning metal shaft turning at thousands of RPMs. If that shaft broke or seized, it would tear the plane, and the pilot, in half. But it solved the problem. The nose was now hollow. Bell stuffed the 37mm cannon, 2.50 caliber machine guns, 2.30 caliber machine guns, and the landing gear into the nose. This configuration created one of the most unique aircraft of World War II. Because the engine was in the back, the nose could be streamlined. It was needle-thin. This gave the pilot incredible forward visibility. And because the nose was empty of the engine, Bell could use a tricycle landing gear, a nose wheel. This was revolutionary in 1938. Every other fighter, the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the 109, was a tail-dragger. They sat nose up on the ground. When a pilot taxied a Spitfire, he was blind. He had to turn back and forth to see where he was going. The P-39 sat level. It looked like a shark waiting on the runway. A pilot could see the tarmac right in front of him. He could brake hard without nosing over. But the mid-engine layout created another quirk. You couldn't put a sliding canopy on top because of the air intake scoop behind the pilot's head. So Bell installed car doors. Literally, automobile-style doors with roll-down windows and handles. When the XP-39 prototype first flew in April 1939, it was a sensation. It hit 390 miles per hour. It climbed to 20,000 feet in 5 minutes. It was faster than the Spitfire MKI. It was faster than the Bf-109E. It was aerodynamic perfection. The Army was thrilled. They ordered 1,000 of them. They thought they had the ultimate interceptor. But then, bureaucracy destroyed the dream. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the predecessor to NASA, took the prototype into a wind tunnel. They were obsessed with drag. They looked at the turbo-supercharger, the device that forced compressed air into the engine to let it breathe at high altitudes, and decided it was creating too much aerodynamic drag. They recommended removing it. Larry Bell was furious. He argued with the Army generals. If you take the turbo off, he warned, this plane will suffocate above 15,000 feet. It will be a beast at sea level, but a fainting goat in the stratosphere. The Army didn't listen. Their doctrine in 1939 was flawed. They believed that the United States was protected by 2 massive oceans. They believed any enemy attack would come from naval bombers flying at low altitude to drop torpedoes on American ports. They didn't think they needed a high-altitude fighter. With the stroke of a pen, they ruined the airplane. They stripped the supercharger. They added armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and more guns, increasing the weight by 1,000 pounds. The resulting plane, the P-39D, was a shadow of the prototype. Its top speed dropped to 360 miles per hour. Its climb rate collapsed. Above 12,000 feet, it was sluggish. Above 20,000 feet, it was helpless. But the production lines in Buffalo were already rolling. Thousands of them were being built. The dies were cast. The tooling was set. And nobody realized the magnitude of the mistake until the shooting started. October 1941. France. The pilots of No. 601 Squadron RAF were on their first combat sweep with the P-39. They had spent weeks training in England, trying to get used to the weird car doors and the tricycle gear. Now, they were hunting the Luftwaffe. The plan was simple: fly over France, lure the German fighters up, and destroy them. But as they crossed the channel and began to climb, the Airacobras began to fail. As they passed 15,000 feet, the manifold pressure gauges dropped. The Allison engines were gasping for air. The pilots pushed the throttles to the firewall, but there was no power. The planes felt heavy, unresponsive. High above them, at 25,000 feet, the German pilots in their Messerschmitt Bf-109 FS looked down. They saw the British struggling. It was a turkey shoot. The Germans could dive on the P-39s, fire, and then use their superior climb rate to zoom back up into the safety of the thin air where the P-39 couldn't follow. The British pilots felt helpless. They were sitting ducks. And there were other problems. When the massive 37mm cannon fired, the cockpit filled with acrid cordite smoke. The ventilation system sucked the fumes right into the pilot's face. Pilots were coughing and choking in the middle of a dogfight. The gun jammed constantly. The recoil mechanism was too complex. If it jammed, you had a 10-foot dead weight in the nose. And then there was the center of gravity. Because the heavy engine was in the middle, the P-39 had almost zero longitudinal stability. It was twitchy. If a pilot pulled too hard in a turn, or stalled the wing, the P-39 would enter a flat spin. In a normal spin, the nose drops and the plane spirals down. You can recover by pushing the stick forward. In a flat spin, the plane stays level but rotates horizontally like a frisbee. The controls lose all authority. The plane simply falls out of the sky, spinning until it hits the ground. Recovering from a flat spin in a P-39 was nearly impossible. Many pilots died in training accidents before ever seeing the enemy. The British pilots nicknamed it the Airacobra. They hated it with a passion. After only 4 combat missions, the RAF made a decision. They withdrew the plane from service. They cancelled the remaining order. They essentially said, "We would rather fly nothing than fly this." In the Pacific, the Americans were finding out the same hard truth. When the Japanese attacked in December 1941, P-39s were stationed in the Philippines and later on Guadalcanal as part of the Cactus Air Force. Against the Mitsubishi A6M0, the P-39 was woefully outmatched. The Zero was a featherweight dancer. The P-39 was a heavyweight brawler with asthma. The Zeros would loop over the P-39s and riddle them with cannon fire. American pilots felt betrayed by their equipment. They wrote letters home begging for P-38 Lightnings or P-40 Warhawks. They wrote songs about how much they hated the plane. One famous verse went, "Don't give me A-39. With an engine that's mounted behind. It will tumble and spin and crush your head in. Asterisk, don't give me A-39. By 1942, the reputation of the Bell Airacobra was destroyed. It was a failure. A heavy, complex, low-altitude mistake that killed its own pilots. But there was one nation that looked at the P-39 specs and didn't see a mistake. They saw the perfect weapon. The Soviet Union. The war on the Eastern Front was nothing like the war in the West. In the West, the air war was strategic. Massive formations of B-17s and Lancasters flying at 25,000 feet to flatten cities, escorted by high-altitude Mustangs and Thunderbolts. It was a war of thin air, radar, and long-range navigation. In the East, the war was tactical. It was a knife fight in a mud pit. The primary job of the Red Air Force was to support the tanks and infantry on the ground. They didn't care about bombing Berlin. They cared about bombing the German tank that was 500 yards away. 90% of the air combat over Russia took place below 10,000 feet. At 10,000 feet, the lack of a supercharger didn't matter. At 10,000 feet, the air was thick. And in thick air, the P-39 was a hot rod. When the British offered their rejected P-39s to Stalin under the Lend-Lease Act, Soviet test pilots took them up. They came down smiling. "No supercharger?" the Soviet engineers said. "But we don't go up there anyway. The German Stukas fly low." "Engine in the middle?" "But it puts 1,000 pounds of steel behind the pilot's back, protecting him from ground fire." 37mm cannon? Excellent. One shot, one kill against a bomber or a tank. Tricycle gear? Perfect for muddy runways. The Soviets asked for more. They asked for all of them. Thus began one of the most epic logistics operations of the war, the Alsib, Alaska-Siberia, route. The planes were built in Buffalo, New York. American pilots, often women of the WASP, Women Air Force Service pilots, ferried them across the United States to Great Falls, Montana. From there, male pilots flew them up through the bitter cold of Canada to Fairbanks, Alaska. At Ladd Field in Fairbanks, the Americans handed the keys to Soviet ferry pilots. It was a clash of cultures. The Americans, warm in their fur-lined jackets, handing over these sophisticated machines to Soviet pilots who often arrived in worn tunics, smoking harsh tobacco. The Soviet pilots would then fly the P-39s across the Bering Strait, over the frozen wasteland of Siberia, a 4,000-mile journey over tundra where a crash meant freezing to death in minutes. They flew in winter, in blizzards, without navigation aids. Thousands of P-39s flowed into Russia this way. The Americans even painted the red stars on them at the factory in Buffalo. When the planes reached the front lines, the frontline pilots climbed in. They noticed things the Americans had taken for granted. In 1942, most Soviet fighters, the Yaks and Lags, didn't have radios. The flight leader had a transmitter, but the wingmen only had receivers, or nothing at all. They communicated by wagging their wings. The P-39 came with high-quality, crystal-clear American radios. For the first time, Soviet squadrons could coordinate complex tactics. They could talk to each other. They could warn each other. On the freezing Russian steppe, where temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, Soviet pilots froze in their cockpits. But in the P-39, the engine was right behind the seat. The coolant lines ran through the floor. It was the warmest plane in the fleet. Soviet pilots flew in their shirt sleeves while Yak pilots wore heavy furs that restricted their movement. But the real revelation was the handling. At 5,000 feet, the P-39 was faster than the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. The tricycle landing gear allowed it to operate from rough, muddy frontline airfields where a Spitfire would have nosed over and crashed. The junk of the West became the gold of the East. One man would turn the Airacobra into a legend. Alexander Pokryshkin. Pokryshkin was not your typical Soviet officer. He was a mechanic's son, a brilliant tactician, and a stubborn rebel. He hated the rigid, obsolete tactics of the Soviet Air Force. In 1941, Soviet doctrine demanded that pilots fly in tight V formations of 3 aircraft, flying straight and level. It made them easy targets for the German free hunt tactics. When Pokryshkin got his hands on the P-39 in 1942, he realized he had a machine that could rewrite the rules. He loved the P-39's instability. The Americans called it dangerous. Pokryshkin called it responsive. Because the weight was in the center, the plane had very low rotational inertia. He could snap it into a turn, fire a burst, and snap back faster than a Messerschmitt. He developed a new formation called the Kuban bookshelf. Instead of flying flat, he stacked his P-39s at different altitudes, like steps on a ladder. The bottom group acted as bait. When the Germans dove on the bait, the higher P-39s would dive on the Germans. It was a vertical trap. But his greatest innovation was how he wired the guns. In the standard P-39, there was one button for the .30 caliber machine guns, and a separate button for the cannon. It was confusing. Pokryshkin had his mechanics rewire the control stick. He connected everything to a single trigger. When he pressed that button, the little Cobra unleashed a wall of lead. 2.50 caliber machine guns, 4.30 caliber machine guns, and the massive 37mm cannon firing simultaneously. The recoil was so violent it felt like the plane had hit a brick wall. The instrument panel would shake so hard the gauges blurred. But the effect on the target was absolute annihilation. During the air battles over the Kuban region in 1943, Pokryshkin went on a rampage. He targeted the German dive bombers, the Stukas and Ju-88s that were harassing Soviet troops. He would dive from above, close to point-blank range, and fire a 1-second burst. One German bomber pilot who survived a Cobra attack described it. I saw the Cobra dive. He didn't fire tracers. He just kept coming. I saw a flash from his nose. There was no machine gun rattle, just a giant thump. Then my right wing was gone. Simply gone. The structure couldn't hold. The German pilots on the Eastern Front began to recognize the silhouette. The long, slender nose. The tricycle gear. The car door. They learned to fear it. German radio intercepts from 1943 captured the panic. A German flight controller would spot Pokryshkin's regiment on radar and broadcast a warning that has become legendary in Russia. Achtung! Pokryshkin is in the air. Cobras! Clear the sector. It is the only time in recorded history that a single pilot's name was used as an official order to retreat. Pokryshkin wasn't just killing planes, he was breaking the Luftwaffe's morale. He ended the war with 59 confirmed kills. Historians believe the real number is over 100, as he often gave his kills to junior pilots to boost their confidence. 47 of those kills were in the P-39 Airacobra. He became a 3-time hero of the Soviet Union. And he did it all in a plane that the U.S. Army used for training because they didn't trust it in combat. But Pokryshkin wasn't the only one. Grigory Rechkalov, another Soviet ace, scored 56 kills. 50 of them were in the P-39. Dmitry Glinka scored 50 kills in the P-39. In fact, of the top 10 highest-scoring Soviet aces of World War II, half of them flew the P-39. The highest-scoring American-built fighter of the war wasn't the P-51 Mustang. It wasn't the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was the reject P-39. There is a persistent controversy about the P-39's usage. Did they use it for tank busting? The American manual said the 37mm gun was for anti-tank work. And for decades, Western historians assumed the Soviets used the P-39 as a ground attack plane, like the Il-2 Sturmovik. They were wrong. Soviet records show that they rarely used the P-39 against tanks. They considered it too valuable. It was an air superiority fighter. They used the cannon to kill bombers, not tanks. The tank buster myth came from the Americans trying to justify the cannon's existence. The Soviets proved that a 37mm shell is just as effective against aluminum ribs and spars as it is against tank armor. But they had to fix the gun first. The Americans complained the gun jammed. The Soviets found out why. It was the grease. The Americans used a heavy cosmoline grease in the gun mechanism. In the freezing Russian winter, that grease froze solid. The gun would fire once and the bolt would stick. Soviet mechanics simply washed the American grease out and replaced it with their own concoction, a mix of sunflower oil and diesel fuel. It didn't freeze. The guns worked perfectly after that. The Soviets also loved the durability of the plane. The P-39 was built like a tank. Because the engine was in the middle, the structure was incredibly rigid. One Soviet pilot, Nikolai Gerasimov, rammed a German bomber in midair with his P-39. He sliced the tail off the German plane with his wing. The German plane crashed. Gerasimov flew his P-39 back to base and landed it. The wing was bent, but it held. By 1944, the P-39 was getting old. Bell Aircraft introduced a new, improved version, the P-63 King Cobra. It was bigger. It was faster. It had a 4-bladed prop and a better supercharger. It solved all the problems of the original. The U.S. Air Force tested it and rejected it again. They didn't want it. They had the P-51 Mustang now. They used the King Cobra as a literal target. They painted them bright orange, armored them heavily, and fired special frangible bullets at them to train bomber gunners. It was called the pinball program. The Soviets were horrified. You are shooting at these magnificent planes? They demanded every single King Cobra Bell could build. In a secret deal, the U.S. shipped 2,400 King Cobras to Russia. But there was a catch. The agreement stated they were only to be used in the Pacific against Japan, not against Germany. Stalin agreed, and then immediately sent them to the German front. Soviet P-63s flew over Berlin in the final days of the war. They protected the T-34s as they encircled the Reichstag. The final nail in the coffin of the Luftwaffe was hammered in by an American plane that America didn't want. When the war ended, the legacy of the Airacobra split in two. In the United States, it was remembered as a lemon. A mistake. The Iron Dog. The Air Force gathered up the remaining P-39s and scrapped them. They melted them down to make aluminum siding for post-war houses and pots and pans. In Russia, the P-39 was a holy relic. Monuments were built to the Airacobra. It was featured on postage stamps. When Alexander Pokryshkin wrote his memoirs, he dedicated entire chapters to the machine. He defended it against all critics. He wrote about the reliability of the Allison engine, the comfort of the cockpit, and the devastating power of the cannon. I liked the Cobra, he wrote. It did not forgive mistakes, but it rewarded skill. It was a weapon for a professional. In 2004, a team of recovery experts was scanning a frozen lake in northern Russia, near Murmansk. They found a magnetic anomaly. Divers went down into the freezing silt. They found a P-39 Airacobra sitting on the bottom of the lake where it had crashed in 1944. It had been underwater for 60 years. When they raised it, the paint was still fresh. The red stars were bright. The American stencils warning, "No step," were still visible. And inside the 37mm cannon, there was still a round in the chamber. The pilot, a young Soviet lieutenant named Baranovsky, had gone down fighting. He hadn't jettisoned the plane. He hadn't called it a dog. He had flown it into the ice to stop the Germans. The Germans laughed at the car doors. They laughed at the engine in the back. They laughed at the lack of a turbocharger. But when the red stars appeared out of the clouds and the 37mm cannon began to thump, the laughter died. The RAF threw it in the trash. The Red Air Force used it to win the war. This is forgotten thunder. The weapons they laughed at. The stories they forgot.